If you enjoy this type of content, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to be part of the community. Now let's get started.
Imagine you wake up one day and the money you saved your entire life buys half of what it bought yesterday. Not because of a declared war, not because of a crisis that appeared in the newspapers. Simply because the purchasing power of your currency was being eroded silently by decisions made long before you noticed anything. This is not science fiction. This happened, and it happened to the most powerful civilization the world has ever seen. In the 3rd century after Christ, the Roman Empire, which controlled territory from North Africa to Britannia, from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia, entered economic collapse. It was not invaded overnight. It did not fall for lack of soldiers or territory. It broke from the inside, and the weapon used against it was its own currency. The Roman denarius was once one of the most trusted coins in history. For centuries, any merchant in the Mediterranean accepted that silver coin without question. It was predictable, stable, recognized. It was the monetary standard of the Western world. But at some point, discreetly, almost imperceptibly, the emperors began to do something that would change everything. Whenever the imperial treasury ran empty because of wars, borders to defend, or armies to pay, the solution found was simple: reduce the amount of silver in the coins and replace it with cheaper metal. At first, the difference was minimal. A reduction here, another there. Almost nothing the untrained I could notice. But those who worked with metals noticed. Those who weighed coins in their hands every day noticed. There was something different, something that didn't add up. And then came the clearest signal of all. Prices began to rise. What could be bought for 2 coins began to cost 8, then 12, then more. The same job, the same product, the same service, but requiring more and more coins to be paid. Here is the point few people understand. Inflation was not the problem. Inflation was the symptom. The problem was at the source, in the decision to issue currency without real backing, to finance the state with a promise that the currency could no longer fulfill. And when that happens, when collective trust in a currency begins to collapse, the effects do not stay limited to prices. They spread throughout the entire structure of society. Trade begins to stall. Contracts lose meaning. Cities, which depended on long-distance exchange to survive, begin to shrink. What Rome experienced in that period was not just a financial crisis. It was the collapse of an invisible infrastructure, trust, that sustained the entire economic and social life of the empire. And here's the question that will guide everything that follows. If the currency was breaking down, what did the people who survived do differently? What did they have, store, or control that protected them while everything around them collapsed? The answer to that question is not obvious, and it will surprise you, because the 4 assets that protected those who survived the Roman collapse are still the same ones that protect wealth in any period of instability. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and write in the comments what you thought and which city or country you're watching from. The process of destroying the denarius did not begin with a decree, a declaration, or a visible crisis. It began with an administrative decision made behind the scenes of power, a decision that, on paper, looked like nothing more than a technical adjustment. Under Emperor Nero, in the 1st century, the silver content of the denarius was deliberately reduced for the first time. The coin kept the same size, the same weight, the same appearance. But inside, it contained less silver and more copper. The difference was only a few percentage points. Almost nothing. The problem is that almost nothing, repeated generation after generation of emperors, becomes everything. Each emperor who took power inherited an empire that cost more than it collected. Wars on the frontiers, legions to pay, officials to maintain, projects to finance. The easiest, and politically most convenient, way out was always the same. Reduce the silver content a little more and mint more coins. The benefit was immediate. The cost was postponed, and no one would be held responsible, because the collapse would take decades to fully manifest. By the time the 3rd century arrived, the denarius had already lost more than 90% of its original silver content. A coin that had once been a symbol of stability had become, in practice, a copper coin with a superficial silver coating so thin that it disappeared with use. And it was at that moment that something deep broke, not in finances, but in collective psychology. People noticed, not all at once, not with technical vocabulary, but with the instinct of those who deal with money every day. Merchants began to prefer receiving payment in goods. Rural landowners started demanding payment in grain, oil, animals, anything that had real value and did not depend on a state promise. And the older coins, with more silver, disappeared from circulation, not because anyone ordered them to be withdrawn, but because those who had them kept them, hid them, took them out of circulation, because good money does not circulate when bad money is available to be spent instead. This behavior collapsed trade in a way that no imperial decree could contain. Money was everywhere. There were more coins in circulation than ever, but long-distance trade was grinding to a halt. Merchants from Alexandria who sold textiles to Gaul, olive oil producers from Hispania who supplied Rome, traders who crossed the Mediterranean with spices and precious metals, all began to pull back. Why? Because long-distance trade requires trust in the medium of exchange. You sell today and get paid tomorrow. You ship a cargo and wait for payment upon arrival. When the currency is stable, this system works. When it loses value every month, no one wants to be the last one holding the paper, or in this case, the devalued coin. Cities, which depended on this commercial flow to be supplied, began to feel the impact. Products that once arrived regularly became scarce. Prices reacted violently. The state, in response, tried to control prices by decree, and failed completely, because no decree can replace the trust that the currency had lost. Here's the most brutal point of this entire story. The collapse was not caused by an external catastrophe. It was not a plague. It was not an invasion. It was not a drought. It was an internal erosion, built decision by decision, emperor after emperor, for nearly 2 centuries. And when the effect finally appeared in a visible way, in prices, in trade, in scarcity, it was already too late to reverse it quickly. Trust, once destroyed, is not rebuilt with decrees. It only returns with time, with consistency, and with concrete results. The empire still existed. The legions still marched. The emperors still promulgated laws. But the invisible infrastructure that sustained all of it, the ability of the currency to carry value from one place to another without losing what it promised, had been destroyed from within. And it was precisely in this chaos that the difference between those who were vulnerable and those who were not became clear. It was not a question of wealth. It was a question of the type of asset each person controlled. When currency loses its value, what remains? That question, which seems abstract, was answered in a very concrete way by those who lived through the Roman collapse. Not in theory, not in philosophical treatises, but in the brutal reality of those who needed to eat, trade, and survive in an environment where economic rules had stopped working. The first asset that protected those who survived was productive land. Not land as speculation, not property as a status symbol, but land that produced food. Wheat, olive oil, wine, livestock. Those who controlled real food production had something that no devaluation could destroy, because the demand for food does not disappear when currency fails. It increases. Large rural landowners who produce their own food emerge from the collapse in a much stronger position than they had entered it. They did not need the monetary system to sustain themselves. And when long-distance trade froze and cities began to empty, they were the ones who absorbed displaced labor, consolidated local power, and became the new social foundation of what remained of the Western Roman world. The second asset was physical gold, not a promise of gold, not a certificate, not credit, not a deposit in some imperial vault. The metal itself, tangible, weighable, verifiable. Gold retained value because it did not depend on any political decision to exist. While the silver denarius collapsed, gold continued to be accepted anywhere in the ancient world, from Persia to Britannia. Here is something many people do not realize. During the collapse of the denarius, gold did not become more valuable because someone decreed that it would. It became more valuable because everything around it lost value. This is an important distinction. Gold did not rise. The denarius fell. And those who held physical gold simply maintained the purchasing power that others were losing. The third asset was practical skill. The blacksmith who repaired plows, the physician who treated wounds, the builder who knew how to raise stone walls, the miller who turned grain into flour. These people were never without work, because what they offered was necessary regardless of the state of the currency. In an environment where contracts lost meaning and payments in currency became increasingly unreliable, what came to matter was direct exchange. I fix your plow. You give me part of your harvest. No intermediary, no currency, no state promise. Those who had real skills had something to offer in this equation. Those who had only monetary accumulation discovered they were holding promises the state could no longer fulfill. The fourth asset was the network of local relationships. Cohesive communities, where people knew one another, trusted one another, and cooperated before the crisis, survived in a very different way from regions where the social fabric was weak. This may sound too soft to be listed alongside land and gold, but historical records are clear. Communities that maintained local organization, whether rural villages, religious communities, or groups of artisans, managed to create their own systems of exchange, protection, and production when the imperial system stopped functioning. They did not depend on Rome to exist, and when Rome collapsed, they continued. Now observe the pattern. None of these four assets depends on a promise. Land produces regardless of decree. Gold exists regardless of monetary policy. Skill works regardless of the financial system. Community operates regardless of a central institution. This is the climax of this entire story, and it is disturbing because it does not point to a sophisticated solution. It points to the opposite. What protected people in the greatest economic collapse of the ancient Western world was precisely what existed before complexity: real, tangible, relational assets. And the most unsettling twist of all, those who lost the most were not the poorest. They were those who trusted the system the most. Savers who accumulated denarii, merchants who built empires based on imperial credit, officials who received salaries in state currency. The more integrated someone was into the Roman monetary system, the more vulnerable they were when it collapsed. Protection did not come from within the system. It came from those who had built something concrete and real outside it, before any visible sign of failure appeared. Rome did not disappear all at once. It withered slowly. The legions continued to exist for decades after the currency collapsed. Emperors continued to be proclaimed. Laws continued to be enacted. But the body of the empire was already hollow inside, sustained by the inertia of centuries, not by a functional economic structure. What remained, over time, was something very different from what had existed before. The great cities shrank. Long-distance trade that had connected 3 continents fragmented into smaller local networks. Economic life returned to revolving around land, local production, and relationships of trust between people who knew each other closely. And in this new world that emerged from the ruins, the 4 assets that had already protected survivors during the crisis continued to be the foundation of everything. Productive land, physical gold, practical skill, cohesive community. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because when a monetary system fails and takes with it the complexity it had built, what remains is always what is real, tangible, and relational. What does not need a promise to function? Now comes the part that is most uncomfortable and most important. The pattern that destroyed the Roman denarius is not exclusive to Rome. It repeated itself in medieval Chinese empires, in paper money issued without control by European governments in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, and Latin American economies at the end of the 20th century. In all these cases, the script was the same: issuance beyond real backing, gradual loss of confidence, accelerating inflation, collapse of trade, forced return to what's concrete. The variable was not the continent. It was not the century. It was not the culture. The variable was always time. How long it would take until confidence was completely exhausted. And what does this mean for those living today, in a world where all currencies are fiat, sustained by trust and political decision, without fixed backing in any metal or physical asset? It does not mean collapse is inevitable tomorrow. It means the risk of monetary erosion is permanent, structural, and independent of which government is in power. It means that blindly trusting a single store of value instrument, especially one controlled by third parties, is a vulnerability that history has already documented with surgical precision. The four assets of the Roman survivors are not a medieval recipe. They are a logic. The logic that real diversification means having assets that function in different scenarios, including one in which the dominant monetary system is under pressure. Productive land remains scarce and necessary. Physical gold remains the only financial asset that is not simultaneously someone else's liability. Practical skill remains impossible to confiscate, devalue, or decree useless. Local community remains the only network that works when large networks fail. None of these four assets will make you invulnerable, but each of them represents a layer of protection that exists outside the logic of promises. And that is exactly what makes the difference when promises stop being fulfilled. The most powerful lesson Rome left is not in history books or economic treatises. It is in the silent behavior of those who survived. They did not predict the collapse with precision. They did not have access to macroeconomic data or sophisticated analysis. They had something simpler and harder at the same time: the willingness not to depend completely on a system they did not control. You do not need to believe the world is ending to do what they did. You only need to recognize that complex systems fail over time, that currencies wear down, and that the difference between those who make it through a crisis standing and those who are destroyed by it rarely lies in intelligence or effort. It lies in the assets each person built before the crisis began. If this content made you think differently about where you store your wealth, leave your comment below, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and say which city or country you're watching from. This helps the channel a lot to keep bringing stories like this.